Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Whitehall Lecture Series. My name is John Blades. I'm the director of the Flagler Museum. It's a pleasure to see you all here for our 26th annual Whitehall Lecture Series. As you know, if you've attended other lectures in this series, this is the town's 100th anniversary year. It's our centennial year, and we thought it'd be great to do a lecture series based on the theme of the architects who designed the iconic buildings here in Palm Beach. Now, if you've attended the other lectures, you know that we're doing lectures this year on, we did one last week on Joseph Urban, we did a lecture on the career in Hastings, this lecture will be on Schultze Weaver, and our last lecture will be on Addison Meisner. But of course, there are a couple of other architects who deserve attention. We just couldn't find speakers for them, and there are architects who created iconic structures here, but you hardly ever hear them talked about. One was named Mortimer Dickinson Metcalf. He designed St. Edward's and that whole Palm Beach Hotel block behind it. Love to know more about him. He was part of the New York State Architect's Office and was involved in Grand Central's terminal design as well, but there seems to be no expert on Mortimer Dickinson Metcalf. We hope one day there will be, and we'll be able to talk more about him. We also wanted to do a lecture on Histon Weeks, who designed Bethesda by the Sea and many other churches like it around the country, but again, we couldn't find anybody who'd written on or spoken on Histon Weeks. So we'll hold those out for the future and come back to those when we find those speakers. I want to take just a second here to remind you that if you have a cell phone, please don't take for granted that it might be off. Please make sure that it actually is off. It's rather disturbing to have one of those go off in the middle of the lecture. And if you happen to wander in with an audio tour wand, please raise your hand so that the staff can collect that from you. Those audio tour wands aren't going to be doing you any good during the lecture, and they can sometimes be set, the alarm in them can sometimes be set off by the AV system in this room. These lectures wouldn't be possible if it weren't for great sponsors, and PNC is the lead sponsor for this year's lecture series. They're a terrific bank to work with, a responsible member of this community, and they sponsor actually a couple of programs here at the museum. And of course, the Palm Beach Post is also our sponsor, and they've been our sponsor here for many of our programs at the museum over the years. We're grateful to those sponsors who help to make these kinds of experiences possible. I want to thank, too, our education department staff who set up these lectures and make all the arrangements for the speakers and do all the legwork that makes this series possible. This afternoon's lecture is on Schultze Weaver. They designed that sort of Medici villa across the way, writ gigantic, that we call the Breakers. And we've got the world's leading expert on Schultze Weaver with us. Jonathan Mogul works for the Wolfsonian. The Wolfsonian happens to have tens of thousands of documents related to Schultze Weaver's work. And John's written or co-authored the only real reference book on Schultze Weaver. So we're delighted to have John Mogul with us here today, and please join me in welcoming him to the Whitehall Lecture Series.
I'm just setting my stopwatch so I don't go over right now, but my phone is off. Thank you all for coming this afternoon, and many thanks to the Flagler Museum for this invitation to speak. I can say without hesitation that this is the most spectacular room that I've ever had the pleasure to speak in. By the way, is the volume okay in back? Can you hear me? Okay. Did someone ask to have it up a little bit? So I'll start off today with a quote, a very short quote. "He is the only architect I ever met that knew the value of $1. These words belong to William R. Keenan, Jr., the head of the Flagler system after Henry Flagler's death. And the subject of the sentence, the architect, is Leonard Schultze, the man whom Keenan hired to design the Breakers Hotel in 1925, and in many ways the hero of my story today. Now, if any of you have ever hired an architect who didn't know the value of $1, then you know just what an important quality that is in an architect. But it's not something ordinarily thought of as a heroic quality, and Leonard Schultze and the firm he established, Schultze & Weaver, are not ordinarily counted among the heroes of American architecture. You won't learn very much about Schultze and Weaver by reading the standard accounts of American architectural history. They're missing from general surveys about American architecture that were published in the last decade or so by Leland Roth and Mark Gellertner, and they make just a cameo appearance in a third book by David Handlin. The editors at Macmillan did not find any space to include Schultze and Weaver in their 4-volume Encyclopedia of Architecture published in the 1980s. So I am not only the world's leading expert on Schultze and Weaver, I can say pretty confidently that I'm the only one. But this is not a mystery story. It's not hard to figure out why Schultze and Weaver are missing from these accounts. The architects who interest architectural historians are naturally enough those who consciously blaze a path into the future, or those who single-mindedly pursue an idiosyncratic vision, or else architects like Carrere and Hastings who built major civic landmarks such as public libraries, museums, or railroad stations. If those are the criteria for inclusion in the architectural canon, then Schultze and Weaver don't cut it. First, rather than embracing the various brands of modernism that were current during the 1920s, during the period when the firm was at its peak in terms of productivity and reputation, Schultze and Weaver worked primarily in period styles. Their designs, to put it simply, look backwards rather than forwards. And unlike the great Beaux-Arts firms of the early 20th century, Schultze and Weaver did not design significant civic buildings. Instead, they worked almost exclusively on commercial projects, on office buildings, clubs, and above all, hotels. It's instructive here to consider the way that Leonard Schultze himself conceived of his role. He was invited to write an article for the periodical Architectural Forum on hotel architecture in 1923. The designer of a modern hotel is in exactly the same position and has the same problems to solve as the designer of any commercial building, Schultze wrote. It is necessary to subordinate and at times sacrifice what the designer frequently considers his individual taste and desires in order to provide adequately for the commercial uses of the building. For Schultze, architecture served a higher goal, but that goal was not truth, beauty, or social improvement. It was, to use his words, return on investment. And Schultze made no bones about the fact that serving that goal might involve his own creative self-effacement. Schultze, in other words, could hardly have been further from the romantic image of the architect as creative genius, locked in a battle of wills with his Philistine clients. He was no Frank Lloyd Wright. His pragmatic and self-effacing attitude was no doubt valued by his clients, like Keenan, but it's an attitude that would have a lot less appeal for subsequent architectural historians. But Schultze and Weaver's accomplishment was not small. What you see here is a composite skyline of all of the buildings the firm completed between 1921, when it was formed, and 1936, and in fact, almost all of those buildings were done by 1931, so that's a decade's worth of work. And you see the breakers there has the central location right beneath the Waldorf Astoria, which I think is an indication of the way that the firm looked at this particular piece of architecture. Although it also occurred to me that it might have something to do with the perfect symmetry of the facade. During this decade, between 1921 and 1931, Schultze and Weaver established themselves as the preeminent designers of luxury hotels in the United States. And they left a major mark on the built environment of two of the most dynamic places in the country, New York City and South Florida. Their accomplishment was based on two things. First, and most obviously, on the meticulous and masterful recreation of the architecture and ornament of past ages, from Italian Renaissance to Spanish Baroque to Georgian English and beyond. And anyone who's ever visited one of their buildings knows just how powerful their rendering of these historical styles continues to be. And second, their accomplishment was based on the successful adaptation of these revival styles of architecture to the needs of the hotel as a complex commercial enterprise. Now, I'm not an architectural historian, I'm a regular historian. And looking at the buildings of Schultze and Weaver through the eyes of a regular historian, they look very significant indeed. And I don't particularly care whether their buildings are in the canon of great American architecture or not. I find these buildings significant as historical artifacts, as objects that reveal a great deal about the people who use them, the people who designed them, the people who own them, and the places in which they were located. That's how I propose to look at the breakers today, and in order to do that, I'm also going to put this hotel in the context of the firm's larger career. Before I start to do that, I wanted to explain my own connection to Schultze and Weaver. About a decade ago, my colleagues at the Wolfsonian and I began to plan an exhibition based on our very large collection of architectural drawings and other kinds of materials from this firm. Research for the exhibition brought us to many places, public and private collections, resulting in loans from all over, including from the Flagler Museum and from the Breakers itself, which was kind enough to lend us some furniture and tableware. In 2005, we finally presented this exhibition called In Pursuit of Pleasure, Schultze and Weaver and the American Hotel, and also produced a companion book, Grand Hotels of the Jazz Age, The Architecture of Schultze and Weaver, which you can find at that table behind you. The invitation to speak about the breakers today has given me the opportunity to return to the research that I did, to reconsider it with fresh eyes, and to go more deeply than I had before into the story of a single building. And it's also an opportunity to show not only items that appeared in the exhibition and the book, but also some interesting things that did not, from the Wolfsonian's own collection and from other sources as well. Schultze and Weaver's Breakers was not the first Breakers Hotel in Palm Beach. I imagine that many of you know the story of Henry Flagler and the Florida East Coast Hotel and Railroad Companies, and so I won't dwell on that at length. But briefly, Flagler's first great Palm Beach resort hotel was the Royal Poinciana, which was completed in 1894, just a few years after Flagler's railroad had extended south to Fort Worth. Even though Flagler enlarged the Royal Poinciana, he soon needed to accommodate more visitors thanks to the booming popularity of Palm Beach at this time, so he built a second hotel on the ocean front, the Palm Beach Inn, which was soon nicknamed the Breakers. When the Palm Beach Inn burned down in 1903, Flagler wasted no time in getting a new Breakers Hotel erected, and this hotel, like its predecessor, became a focal point of Palm Beach high society. In March this was the new Breakers, by the way, the second Breakers. In March 1925, the second Breakers Hotel burned down too. By this point, Flagler, who died in 1913, had been succeeded by his business partner and brother-in-law, William R. Keenan Jr. Keenan resolved to build a new Breakers as soon as possible and aim for it to be, in his words, the finest resort hotel in the country, and one that would not burn down so easily. According to his memoirs, Keenan considered a number of well-established architects for the job, including Henry Bacon and John Russell Pope, both of whom were known as designers of grand neoclassical structures like the Jefferson and Lincoln Memorials, the National Archives Building, and the National Gallery. But in the end, Keenan settled on a firm that was quite literally closer to home. Keenan's New York residence was at the Park Lane, a relatively small and fashionable apartment hotel near Grand Central Station that had opened only the year preceding the fire at the Breakers in 1924. He was impressed by the Park Lane's Italian Renaissance interiors and facade, and he decided to hire its architects, Schultze and Weaver, to design his new breakers. And this is Schultze and Weaver just a few years after the completion of the breakers. Compared to luminaries like Pope and Bacon, Schultze and Weaver was still in its infancy when Keenan handed it the breakers commission. But the firm was already very much on solid footing. In fact, it was on solid footing from the day it was formed, thanks to the background of its two founding partners. Neither man was particularly young when they formed the firm, when they formed their partnership in 1921. Schultze was in his mid-40s and had already worked for 2 decades for the well-known New York firm Warren and Wetmore. Schultze's training was very much in the Beaux-Arts tradition, a term taken from the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, where many of America's top architects had studied beginning in the late 19th century. And those of you who were here a few weeks ago for Laurie Osmond's talk on Carrere and Hastings will find what I'm going to say now somewhat familiar. Beaux-Arts training emphasized skilled draftsmanship, the integration of architecture and decorative arts, learning from past practice, from the architecture of the past, and mastery of the classical principles of harmony and order. This kind of training produced architects who were adept at adapting the forms and symbolic language of Roman temples or Italian palazzos to the practicalities of modern building types. It was a style that seemed appropriate for public buildings and monuments, for universities, for World's Fair pavilions, for banks, and for the homes of business leaders like the one we're in right now. Schultze himself never went to Paris, but he studied in the US with a former student of the École, E.L. Masqueret, who ran an atelier that trained young Americans according to the French model. And Warren and Wetmore, the firm that Schultze joined in 1903, was very much a Beaux-Arts firm. Schultze's abilities quickly became apparent, and he was made chief of design for one of the most significant projects in the history of New York City. The building of Grand Central Station and the development of Terminal City, a complex of office buildings, apartment buildings, and hotels to either side of the terminal and to its north. Thanks to his work on Terminal City, Schultze made 2 connections that would be critical to his future. One of these was John McEntee Bowman, who would soon become one of the country's leading hotel executives as head of the Bowman Biltmore Hotel chain. And 2 of the hotels that Schultze designed for the Terminal City project, the New York Biltmore and the Commodore, belonged to Bowman's growing hotel empire. And you can see the Biltmore, it's sort of the twin tower building just to your left of Grand Central. The other key contact that Schultze made in these years was S. Fullerton Weaver, a civil engineer and developer who had real estate interests in Terminal City. In joining forces with Weaver, Schultze was joining his own architectural experience to Weaver's engineering and real estate acumen, and also to Weaver's New York high society connections. Weaver was president of the West Side Tennis Club in New York, and he hosted parties where the guest list included people like Alfred Sloan, the president of General Motors, and Reginald Vanderbilt, an heir to the New York Central Railroad fortune. Schultze, although he came from more humble beginnings than Weaver, soon began to travel in similar circles in the 1920s. He was a member of the Society of Mayflower Descendants, of August Meisner's Everglades Club here in Palm Beach, of the Scarsdale and Westchester Biltmore Clubs in New York, and the Jonathan Club in Los Angeles. And I might add that he himself designed the last 2 of those clubs. Schultze and Weaver then were extremely well positioned to succeed as luxury hotel architects. Through Schultze, they commanded a critical business connection with Bowman and also plenty of experience. And both partners belonged to the same social worlds as developers, investors, and executives, the kinds of people who could get them good commissions. Beyond these connections, they also had first-hand knowledge of the customs and the tastes of the people who would be staying in the hotels that they designed. They were designing buildings for people who were very much like themselves. As you'll see, the connection to Bowman and his Bowman-Biltmore chain had a lot to do with the firm's rapid rise to the top. The first hotel they completed was the Los Angeles Biltmore, it's a 1,000-room behemoth on Pershing Square. With this hotel, Schultze Weaver started out with a bang. It was the biggest hotel west of the Mississippi when it was completed, and it was featured prominently in the architectural press. More commissions from Bowman soon followed in quick succession. The Sevilla Biltmore in Havana, the Atlanta Biltmore, and of course the Miami Biltmore in Coral Gables. Another early project was the Park Lane, the hotel where Keenan made his New York home. South Florida, with its land boom and startling growth, was the place where Schultze and Weaver really made their mark in these early years. Besides the Miami Biltmore, they designed hotels for two of Miami Beach's leading developers, the Nautilus Hotel for Carl Fisher, which stands on the western edge of or stood on the western edge of the island facing Biscayne Bay. It's on the site where Mount Sinai Hospital now stands. And the Roney Plaza for Newton Roney on the ocean front at 23rd Street. These were the largest, most expensive, and most lavish hotels in Miami Beach at the time. And they helped to realize the dreams of Fisher and Roney to turn the barrier island into a playground for the wealthy, one that could rival even Palm Beach. Just across Biscayne Bay, Schultze and Weaver also designed two office towers in downtown Miami, the Ingraham Building and the Miami Daily News Building, which is now the Freedom Tower. Schultze and Weaver's hotels helped define the architectural character of Miami. Several years earlier, before they started working in Florida, architects like Richard Keneal and Addison Meisner had introduced the Mediterranean Revival style to the region. These architects created a picturesque, fanciful architecture that mixed Spanish, Moorish, Italian, and a variety of other influences, and that seemed well suited to the subtropical climate of Florida's Atlantic coast. Schultze and Weaver, who already had some experience with Spanish-style architecture from their work in Los Angeles and Havana, offered their own version of the Mediterranean Revival for their Miami area hotels. They roofed their hotels with red ceramic tiles and created intricate ornamental details in cast iron. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to show you the Nautilus. There it is, with the gondolier in front, and the Roney Plaza. Okay, caught up. They included ornamental details in cast iron and cast concrete on the facades of their hotels. Most famously, Schultze and Weaver topped their Miami area hotels with picturesque towers meant to evoke Spanish building traditions. The Nautilus had twin cupolas, and I'll go back to that slide, that were reminiscent of Spanish colonial buildings. Both the Roney Plaza and the Miami Biltmore, let's go back to the Roney Plaza, as well as the Daily News Building in downtown Miami, all had stepped towers modeled after the Giralda, the Moorish minaret that was converted in the 16th century into a cathedral and became one of the best known and most imitated structures in all of Europe. The interiors of the hotels echoed the statements made by the exteriors. Beamed ceilings, either made of wood or painted plaster, and tiled floors were in evidence in dining rooms, lounges, and lobbies. At the Biltmore, which you can see here, the Miami Biltmore, the lounge and main lobby were furnished with antique chests, chairs, and torchairs, while rugs and draperies in Italian and Spanish styles adorned the walls and floors. With these buildings, Schultze and Weaver helped to monumentalize the Mediterranean Revival in Miami, taking a style that in Miami had generally been applied to smaller buildings, especially private homes, and realizing it on the grandest scale. Okay, so let's go back to the breakers. As I hope I've convinced you, Keenan hired architects who knew what they were doing, and he took no chances, insisting that Schultze personally supervise all aspects of the design process, down to the furnishing of public spaces and guest rooms. The two men agreed right off that the new breakers would be based on Italian Renaissance models, which would distinguish it from such Spanish-themed local landmarks as Meisner's Everglades Club and Joseph Urban's Mar-a-Lago, which was at that time under construction, although not yet completed. Schultze took a trip to Italy where he found inspiration for the design of the hotel and returned with furniture, rugs, and other items as models for the new hotel's furnishings. As Keenan put it very bluntly, there is not an original thing in the house, but he went on to add, the result was beyond words. Just as an aside, the Flagler Museum holds an artifact of this design process, a scrapbook very humbly nicknamed the Bible, which contains samples of carpets, upholstery, wall hangings, and other features for every room in the hotel, as well as photos of chairs, tables, and bird cages. The Wolfsonian was very lucky, thanks to the Flagler Museum's generosity, to be able to show the Bible in our Schultze and Weaver exhibition. As you'll recall, the old breakers burnt down in 1925. Keenan was determined to have a new hotel open in time for the 1927 winter season. By the fall of 1925, the architects had completed many of the design drawings, and by early December, Turner Construction had been awarded the job of building the hotel. Turner mounted an extraordinary campaign to finish the job over the next 12 months, complicated by clogged rail lines and bad weather in Florida. The job required more than 1,300 rail carloads of material delivered straight to the building site by a temporary siding from the Florida East Coast Railroad, and it required the efforts of more than 1,000 construction workers, as well as dozens of artisans who were brought from Italy in order to execute the decoration for the building. On December 29, 1926, the hotel opened for an informal dinner, and it was open for business several weeks later. Keenan called it the best construction job he'd ever seen. Now, I don't want to spend your time this afternoon giving you a virtual tour of the breakers. It doesn't make a lot of sense given that the hotel is just a short walk from here, and many of you, I imagine, are probably already pretty familiar with it. What I'm more interested in is to look at some of the familiar aspects of the building in order to identify the experiences it was meant to provide and the messages it was meant to send, and then to look at what I believe may be some less familiar aspects of the building. As I think is fairly well known, a number of Italian palazzos and villas served as loose inspirations for the building. The facade and the overall massing of the structure, for example, was a clear reference to one of the most admired and well-known residences of the Italian Renaissance, the Villa Medici in Rome. And note here how the renderer in that presentation drawing, Chester Price, has included some cypress trees in among the palms in order to Mediterraneanize the scene. Guests arrived at the hotel by passing through formal gardens, and those of you who are here for the Carrere and Hastings talk will note the geometric harmony between the building itself, which is shown on the right, and the larger grounds, which was a hallmark of Beaux-Arts design. They entered through an imposing, or they continued to enter, I should say, through an imposing porte cochere, which signaled a sharp break from the everyday realities of the world outside. So, as if they were passing into a separate realm. Once inside, they found themselves in the hotel's vast main lobby, looking up at barrel-vaulted ceilings decorated with frescoes painted by some of the Italian architects who were brought to Palm Beach in order to lend authenticity to the surroundings. The lobby was said to be an emulation of Genoa's Palazzo Carrega. From the lobby, one could enter the elaborately planted central patio, or ride an elevator to the upper stories of the building, or continue to the south to find an arcade of elegant shops, or proceed down one of two west-east loggias to discover the remaining public rooms. Facing the ocean, running south to north, was the Grand Loggia, which is now the hotel's Mediterranean ballroom. This was inspired by another of Genoa's palazzos. Just off the Grand Loggia is the South Lounge, designed after a room in the Doge's Palace in Venice. In this room, Schultze Weaver employed plaster to emulate the hand-carved wood of the ceiling in the original room, and they filled the niches at the base of the ceiling with portraits of New World explorers. The ornament on the fireplace, which you can see in the design drawing here, was meant to memorialize the encounter between conquistadors and natives of the New World. Though actually in the executed fireplace in the hotel, the meeting between the old world and the new is handled somewhat differently as an image of the globe turning on its axis. Each of the public rooms was designed with the same opulent detail, as you can see here from a ceiling detail in one of the loggias. And by the way, when you see a poor quality photograph, such as in this slide, you can assume that that is a picture that I took myself rather than by the Wolfsonian staff photographer. The breakers offered many tangible luxuries. It offered fine dining, high-end shopping, comfortable accommodations, golf, tennis, and bathing in the ocean. It also offered the luxury of exclusivity. It was a place where the wealthy could go to enjoy the company of their own kind without having to rub shoulders with members of the lower classes, except, of course, in the context of the hotel's impeccable service. I want to suggest that the hotel's architecture and its opulent decor were an equally important element in the guest's experience. By fashioning a scaled-up version of the Villa Medici and filling it with rooms that suggested the interiors of other Renaissance palazzos, the breakers offered two things in particular: escape and affirmation. It offered escape from the realities of the contemporary world by allowing its guests to imagine not only that they had traveled across an ocean, but that they had traveled backwards in time several hundred years. And it offered affirmation of the high social station and cultural attainment of these same guests by identifying them with the cultivated aristocracy of one of the glorious episodes in Europe's past, and also identifying them with the bold and enterprising explorers who sailed from Europe to discover the New World. During a period when the status of the wealthy and powerful in the United States often appeared to be under threat, a time of Red Scares and a militant labor movement, and later after 1929, of financial instability and federal government intervention in economic life, the breakers seemed to be a place where these forces could be held at bay, where they could not intrude. The breakers, as I suggested at the beginning, speaks volumes about the aspirations and self-image of the people for whom it was designed. But there is more to the story of the breakers than architects and hotel guests looking backwards in time and across an ocean to effect an escape from the modern world, just as there is more to the breakers than its gardens, its facade, and its lovely period rooms. What I've presented so far are images of the breakers that many of us know and that its guests would have experienced. But I'd like to focus also on some features of the hotel that were meant to be out of sight of the guests. And in doing so, I want to make it clear that despite appearances, the Breakers was a modern building designed to meet modern aims. It was modern, first of all, in its construction. Let me show you again one of the brilliantly detailed design drawings that Schultze and Weaver produced to specify the interior ornament of the public rooms, this time, again, the main lobby. You'll note the red circles at the top and bottom of the drawing. Those are circles that I added myself, because if you take a closer look at the drawing, which is actually a section through the wall, I'll go back. You can see the structural steel I-beams that were necessary to engineer the wide spans of these expansive rooms. Necessary, that is, within the budget of operators who intended to earn a return on investment. As this photo of the construction process shows, the hotel's landmark towers were also supported by a frame of steel beams and columns. In all, about 1,000 tons of structural steel went into the building. In other words, the Breakers was a 16th century palazzo buttressed by a 20th century skeleton. The hotel, of course, was also strictly up to date in the amenities it provided to its guests, including a heating system, high-speed elevators, synchronized timekeeping, and you won't be surprised to learn, a complete fire alarm system. The hotel featured an entire service wing. Here I've also indicated that in red. You can see it at the upper right of the slide there. A large section of the building's ground floor and basement dedicated to various functions that were critical to the comfort of hotel guests, but that had to be carried out without intruding on these same guests' experiences. Food preparation and laundry were perhaps the most significant of these functions, and each had its own space organized along quasi-industrial lines to make it operate as efficiently as possible. So Schultze and Weaver's mastery of hotel architecture meant not only designing Renaissance lobbies and dining rooms, but also seeing to the placement of dishwashers and warming tables, washing machines, extractors, and giant flatwork ironers. Here are a couple of details of the kitchen plan, and again, please excuse the photography here, and a photo of the Breakers' kitchen. And here, again, this is a plan of the laundry room and some details to show the layout of the machinery. The layout of these facilities was subject to the same laws of scientific management that governed any productive enterprise. A 1923 article on hotel laundries insisted that machines should be placed so that they will preserve the correct sequence of operations and permit the linen to pass through the various processes without wasted motion. So that was of equal concern to Schultze and Weaver as any other aspect of their design process. Even the revival architecture and decoration of the Breakers can be viewed in the same light, as products of a modern business strategy. The idea was crystallized for me by an article written by John McEntee Bowman, the president of the Bowman Biltmore Company and Schultze and Weaver's early patron. He wrote this in the early 1920s. According to Bowman, the chief responsibility of the hotel architect was to create, quote, atmosphere, that intangible contribution to the well-being and satisfaction of hotel guests. Atmosphere, as Bowman described it, was a product of, quote, hotel exteriors and interiors which attract and hold interest, establish correct impressions, and create memories which ensure recurring patronage and recommendation. So this is how, I would argue, we might understand the painstaking and convincing application of Italian Renaissance design at the Breakers, as the creation of an atmosphere, a modern luxury amenity among other luxury amenities. And as William R. Keenan realized, no architectural firm in the country was better prepared to provide that amenity than Schultze and Weaver. So I want to move towards the end with a brief coda about Schultze and Weaver after the Breakers. 1926 was in many ways a turning point for the firm. For one thing, the Florida property boom ended that year, and building in the region went into a long slump. Up until that year, Florida had been the focal point for Schultze Weaver's work, and after, they had only one significant commission in the state, in addition to August Meisner's Cloisters Inn in Boca Raton, which was renamed the Boca Raton Club. Their biggest jobs for the rest of the decade were in New York. 1926 also saw an important personnel change, the hiring of Lloyd Morgan as the firm's chief designer. Morgan had studied for 3 years at the École des Beaux-Arts, and after his training, he'd worked in France for several years. Thanks to his experience, Morgan had an intimate familiarity and most likely a comfort with continental European trends in architecture and decorative arts that the older Schultze probably lacked. The Breakers was probably the last of Schultze Weaver's hotel commissions in which Morgan did not have a major hand, although he did produce 2 presentation drawings in 1927, sketching out a plan for the future development of the site. In the year following the Breakers' opening, Schultze Weaver completed 2 more resort hotels, the General Oglethorpe outside Savannah, and the Montauk Manor, another project for Carl Fisher on Long Island. And you can see they were adept at Tudor revival as well as the more Mediterranean styles. For the last years of the decade, their major jobs were all in New York and all involved a particular building type, the skyscraper hotel. With the Sherry Netherlands, the Lexington, and the Pierre, the firm stuck very much with the historicism that had always been its calling card. These buildings can be seen in some respects as revival mansions stretched into skyscrapers. The firm's biggest and most famous commission was the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, which opened in 1931. Here, at first glance, Schultze Weaver made a sharp break, choosing to embrace the fashionable Art Moderne style. They gave the enormous building a stripped-down profile and added machine-age details to the facade. It was a building that was entirely at home in the same skyline as the Chrysler Building and the Empire State Building, which I'm pretty certain were completed in the same year. They also designed interior spaces like the ballroom and the entrance foyer, which you can see here, that had a sleek contemporary feel to them. But it's worth noting that the guest rooms and many of the smaller function rooms in the Waldorf were still decorated in period styles and furnished with antique fireplaces. As it turned out, the Waldorf Astoria was the last hotel that Schultze and Weaver designed. With the onset of the Great Depression, hotel commissions dried up, and the firm had to make do for a number of years with small jobs. During these lean years, they benefited very much from the repeal of prohibition, which brought commissions for bars in a number of the hotels that they had already designed. Here's a design drawing for the bar at the Sherry Netherlands, and here are some drawings for a bar at the Breakers, and you can see that the stylized figures and reflective surfaces of the Art Moderne style were now very much the norm. Only in the last years before the war did the firm, now called Leonard Schultze and Associates after Weaver's death in 1939, begin getting big jobs again. But these were of a very different type than the firm's high-profile triumphs of the 1920s. Instead of landmark hotels, they were designing hospitals, government buildings, and large suburban housing developments for the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company. Finally, I want to make one comment about the fate of the hotels that Schultze and Weaver designed in the 1920s. These hotels were generally hailed as aesthetic triumphs when they opened, but many of them were a lot less successful as business enterprises. The Waldorf Astoria barely made it through the 1930s, surviving mainly because of heavy patronage by the U.S. government. Other hotels like the Miami Biltmore, the Pierre, and the Lexington flirted with bankruptcy during these years. I'm not aware of any major financial difficulties encountered by the Breakers in its early years, But if that's the case, then it was probably more the exception than the norm among Schultze Weaver's hotels. These hotels, as we've seen, were designed to make a profit, but their designs assumed a certain set of economic conditions, the conditions of the Roaring Twenties, that did not last very long. In some cases, as with the Waldorf, in fact, those conditions had already ended by the time the hotel opened. Hotel building resumed in the U.S. later on in the mid to late 1930s, especially in Miami Beach, which came out of the Depression before most of the rest of the country. But by then, the model for what would make for a profitable facility had changed considerably, as can be seen in the much smaller structures offering very few amenities, generally only a bar and a pool, that came to define Miami Beach's Art Deco district. And rather than Schultze and Weaver's, it was a new generation of architects like L. Murray Dixon and Henry Hohauser who made their names designing these buildings. Only in the era of post-war prosperity did lavish, full-service, luxury resorts seem feasible to build once again. And by then, it was Morris Lapidus, not Schultze and Weaver, who provided the designs. My point is that it's possible that Leonard Schultze may not, after all, have understood the value of a dollar quite as perfectly as William R. Keenan believed. The hotels he designed may have provided a better return on investment had he scaled back his ambitions and made them less splendid. But we who can enjoy them today can count ourselves lucky that he didn't. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to take any questions that you might have. Yes?
How many rooms in the breakers?
I believe that it's 450. It may be 350, but I think it's 450, and the answer is in that book on the table back there. Yes?
How were they able to build that in 1 year?
Well, they had over 1,000 construction workers on the job. And the firm, the Turner Construction, went through an incredibly elaborate planning process to make sure that all of the subcontracts were let at the proper time so that there wouldn't be bottlenecks in the sequential processes. In fact, they were, even before they won the contract, had spent many weeks planning out the job. So Keenan did not want to miss, he missed the 1926 winter season. He did not want to miss the 1927 season. I imagine the fact that Turner Construction was so well prepared to get the job done was a critical factor in the fact that they won the contract. But it was really a matter of good planning and brute force.
And I might add, there was no building department in Palm Beach at the time.
Also, I'm certain a very, very important factor.
We have a question online, John.
Okay?
Somebody online would like to know if Frederick Taylor's ideas about scientific management, the way the building was laid out and all that, how prominent was that in their design throughout their buildings?
The question has to do with Frederick Taylor, who was sort of the management guru of his day and was particularly concerned with the sort of efficient organization of workspaces so that there would be no wasted motion on the part of workers. And the answer is yes, Taylor's ideas and the kind of ideas that were around Taylor had a great impact on the design of hotels. I can't speak specifically about whether Schultze read Taylor or knew of him or was influenced by him, but in general, the hotel business, which I believe was the 7th or 8th largest industry in the United States at this time, was going through a process of corporate consolidation, the creation of firms like the Bowman Biltmore chain, and the rationalization of management processes so that what had been generally sort of family owned and run enterprises suddenly became very corporate, very well organized, and very rational, and that extended down into the layout of things like kitchens and laundries, into the maximum possible exploitation of the space of the hotel for money-making purposes. There was a great emphasis on on the ratio between the square feet of those spaces in the hotel that did not generate an income and those that did. And if you had those ratios out of line, your hotel was in trouble. And the Breakers was, if not unique, very distinctive in the very generous amount of public, non-income earning space that the designers allowed for. And I think that was a reflection of the fact that this was not simply a luxury hotel, it was a top-of-the-line luxury hotel. Yes?
How does the Biltmore in Palm Beach fit into this story?
Do you mean the Miami Biltmore? Or the, I'm not aware of a Biltmore in Palm Beach.
Well, the name has changed several times
Oh, I
over the
see.
years, but there's currently a Biltmore Hotel that also is twin towers, also reflective of the Medici villa. The villa.
Oh, I believe that I saw that hotel coming over the causeway.
Yes.
It's sort of a more contemporary gesture towards the Breakers.
Yes, mid-1920s as well.
Oh, it is from that age. Yes, I'm sorry, I really don't know very much about the hotel, but it's interesting that it has so much of the same, at least on the outside, so much of the same kind of influence from the Medici villa.
It's condos now.
It's condos.
Yeah.
Yes.
How did the Breakers survive without air conditioning in the long out-of-season months, which are the worst?
Well, I believe that in the early years of its operation, it was not open out of season. I am speaking from memory here, and so I will hedge that by saying I believe. But that was true of many resorts that they made, and it's still true to a large degree, that they make their money in season, and out of season it's a matter of controlling costs. In the guest rooms at the Breakers, there were transom windows over the doors, there may still be, I haven't been up there, that you can prop open so you can get a breeze through from the outside without having to open the actual door to your room. So there was some sort of low-tech ventilation built into the hotel.
John, we have another question online. The question is about how these hotels might have affected the retail with their large retail operations, might have affected the neighborhoods in terms of balance of retail and residential.
That's interesting, and I don't know how Palm Beach in the 1920s was laid out in terms of its commercial district. Many of the resort hotels were sort of self-contained islands. They were located in places where there weren't a lot of retail options in the neighborhood. The Miami Biltmore, for instance, is in the middle of a residential neighborhood in Coral Gables. So the idea of the resort was generally a place where you did not venture out more than you needed to, and they were located, for the most part, in places that were pretty far from retail centers. The Breakers and its relationship to, I don't even know the name of the street here that we passed through.
Well, several now. Worth Avenue is probably what you think.
And I don't know whether they were major shopping streets in the 1920s. There may be someone who knows more about local history here than I do.
We'll come back to that.
But there was plenty of money sloshing around in Palm Beach in the 1920s, enough to go around, I would think, for the shops in the Breakers and outside.
You had a business district on Main Street, which is called Royal Punch down the way now.
Right.
And also on Bradley Place,
Mm-hmm.
over where the Biltmore is. There was quite a early business district in both of those areas, which served the Breakers.
Mm-hmm. But you couldn't necessarily get everything you needed within the hotel, but there was a whole sort of wing with small shops inside the hotel grounds. Yes?
Does the company exist now? And if it does, what is it, a failure to bring in younger architects to compete? You know, that they got caught up in...
Oh, Schultze Weaver. The company lasted in one form or another until, I think it's about 1960. After Schultze died, Lloyd Morgan, who was, I mentioned, who was joined the firm as the chief designer in 1926, took over, and it was called Lloyd Morgan and Associates. And my impression is they did pretty well, but with much more kind of mundane, everyday commissions than the kind of glamorous jobs that they got in the 1920s. I don't know whether the closing of the firm was a result of failure or was it just Morgan winding it down. We have lots and lots of drawings in our collection from Schultze and Weaver, more than 10,000 I would think. We don't have a lot of documents. We don't have many business records for the firm. So that kind of question is difficult for me to answer, but I do know sort of the history of the company in very skeletal terms. Is there a question from the back? I'm sorry, from the background.
Do you know how much it cost to build the original Breakers Hotel and what that would be in current dollars?
The original Breakers, meaning this Breakers, or the very first Breakers? I'm sorry?
The existing Breakers.
No, I don't know, and I don't remember whether I ever knew that. But there is probably, in fact, I'm sure that I did once know that because we have a list that the firm produced of the cost of all of their projects, but I'm afraid that's a number I don't have in my head. Yes?
Other than the Ingram building, which I think was owned by the Flagler system, what other office buildings do you know of that they built?
Well, as I mentioned, they built the Miami Daily News and Metropolis building, which is the Freedom Tower now. Within Miami or South Florida, those are the only large buildings that I know that they built. They did have some office buildings elsewhere in New York. They did some work in California, in Toronto. But in South Florida, it was the hotels and those two office buildings that were their biggest projects. Is it one more question? Okay.
Can you talk about how the Breakers today is different from the Breakers back in 1926?
It's been a few years since I visited, but to me the most significant change is that there's now a second ballroom between what's now called the Mediterranean ballroom. It was the Grand Loggia. I showed you a slide of that. So there's another ballroom that sits between that and the ocean. So that's a fairly major change to the footprint of the building. Many, if not all, of the public rooms have been restored, I think probably more than once, and very beautifully. So if one visits the Breakers, although there are some changes, you can get still a very strong sense of many of the original spaces in the building. I know that they took a great deal of care. I might add that the Breakers, at least several years ago, was offering tours of the building on Wednesday afternoons by a gentleman named James Ponce, who's very elderly, but I believe is still alive, and I don't know whether he still does the tours, but I learned a great deal myself from going on such a tour, so I recommend it highly to any of you who want to learn more and want to see the real article.
Bless his heart, he's still very much alive.
Okay, I'm very glad to hear that. Well, thank you very much, and I will be happy to speak with anyone who has further questions individually. Thank you.
Thank you all for your attention. Our final lecture will be next week at the same time on Addison Meisner. It will be delivered by Carol Seabaum. I want to thank our sponsors again, PNC and the Palm Beach Post, and thank those who joined us online in the Opal Room. We had one visitor here online from Scotland today. Thank you all.